While the flood may be a huge part of some of Halo's greatest moments, I think it's fair to say they're also at least somewhat responsible for one of the levels many consider to be the series' worst. And if you played through the trilogy, then you probably know there's very few levels I could be referring to. Cortana in Halo 3 definitely springs to mind, but perhaps the most obvious choice is the library from Halo Combat Evolved. The library has been heavily criticised by fans over the years for its many shortcomings, and to a certain extent at least, rightfully so, but equally what I found is that many focus squarely on those shortcomings without ever considering why some of them could also be considered strengths as well. With that being the case, I want to spend some time taking a closer look at the design behind the library and examine whether it really is as bad as many people seem to think it is, or if it still has some qualities which deserve praise. If you enjoy the video, do consider hitting subscribe and the notification bell, I'd really appreciate the support. And now, let's start by delving a little deeper into the library's level design. When you look at the library in terms of its map, it's difficult to make the case that it's an altogether brilliantly designed level. Quite often, it manages to achieve the amazing feat of being both very linear and very confusing at the same time. Its surroundings are consistently visually similar to the point it can often be difficult for players to figure out exactly where they are in the level. The library's grey hallways provide little in terms of discernible landmarks for players to orientate themselves around, although 343 Guilty Spark does do that job at times, and the lack of distinction between its different areas means it's often more difficult than it really should be for players to ascertain which direction they should actually be heading in. The fact it's so difficult to navigate is absolutely a bad thing. Indeed, it's something 343 Industries even attempted to rectify in Halo's Anniversary Edition, and visually it's very monotonous, but it does begin to make a lot more sense once you understand exactly what the level is trying to accomplish thematically. In comparison to the levels which preceded it, what the library does a great job of is demonstrating the incredible scale of the Forerunner facilities which sprawl across Halo's Installation 04. Previous levels like Assault on the Control Room or even 343 Guilty Spark do go some way to illustrating similar, but the library's grey, nondescript hallways, which go on seemingly forever, really take that sense of scale to another level. And those cold, uninviting hallways also serve a secondary purpose. The library may be an environment which lacks warmth, but nonetheless it seems like a safe haven for players at first glance, somewhere they're able to catch their breath, having been pursued relentlessly by the Flood during the second half of 343 Guilty Spark, which creates a wonderful contrast. At any other time the library would seem like an unsettling locale straight from the off, but because of the events leading into it, those hallways actually serve, albeit temporarily, to foster a sense of relief in players. The entrance of the Flood, however, is designed to quickly shatter that moment of calm, and it soon becomes clear that if 343 Guilty Spark acted as the Flood's grand introduction, then the library is designed to make it abundantly clear what an overwhelming force they are. We'll look at how those numerous encounters with the Flood play out very shortly, but before I get to that, I want to highlight why the Flood works so well alongside the design of the library itself. As mentioned, the library isn't the first time players encounter an alien structure in Halo Combat Evolved, but it is by far the most alien out of any encountered up until that point. And when combined with the Flood, it feels all the more unfamiliar. Earlier levels featured a mix of Forerunner facilities and outdoor areas much like those on Earth, and even 343 Guilty Spark had plenty of Marines hanging around to make players feel at least a little more at home. But there's no humanity within the confines of the library, and the Flood, an enemy which can at best be described as inhuman, do much to further the feeling players had of being a small fish in a very large, but also very alien pond. Much like the environment itself feels unlike anything players would encounter on Earth, the Flood feel unlike anything they have fought so far. Players are no longer battling the Covenant, an enemy which, in some ways at least, mirrors humans in the way they use tactics and communicate, in Earth-like outdoor settings, but instead fighting an enemy that shares little in common with humans in an environment unlike anything on Earth. It takes players completely out of their comfort zone and makes them feel trapped. The Flood also appear in such vast numbers throughout the level that they serve to make the library's huge hallways feel much more enclosed than they actually are. Playing through the level again, I was amazed at how much smaller areas began to feel once the Flood were introduced, and I think this is kind of the point. It clearly demonstrates to players why they're called the Flood. They enter an area in great waves and consume everything in their path. The Flood are so prevalent throughout the level that it very quickly becomes clear what a truly relentless force they actually are. Players take on that relentless force across a fairly long level, one that feels especially lengthy because of the distinct lack of changes in pace or environment which would otherwise break the level up into more easily identifiable sections. The Silent Cartographer, for example, is essentially a level made up of 3 segments: the beach landing through to reaching the locked security door, finding the security console and returning to the unlocked door, and finally locating the map room before escaping. The library, on the other hand, feels like one long stretch, which perfectly mirrors the environment itself. It's indistinct, every hallway and room seemingly blend together, and it never feels like the pressure on players lets up. Is it too long? Well, the answer to that question is a resounding yes. It far outstays its welcome, and in my view it probably would have worked better as a shorter segment at the end of 343 Guilty Spark. But thematically at least, it does still work. If the level design and mere presence of the flood make the library feel alien, and the contrast between its empty and flood-filled hallways serve to highlight the flood's overwhelming nature, then the library's length ensures players are mentally exhausted by the time the mission concludes. It gives players true insight into what a prolonged fight with the flood would have actually been like for Master Chief. To put it simply, by the time players finish the library, I think they're meant to feel worn out. At this point in the video, you might be thinking that I've nothing but praise for the library, but it's when looking at how the level actually plays that things start to fall apart. Unfortunately, everything I've described so far as a positive in terms of the emotions the library evokes, what it's designed to make you feel, are also intimately tied to why it's one of the least entertaining levels gameplay-wise across the entire Halo trilogy. Let's start with the Flood themselves. One of the defining features of Halo Combat Evolved when it released back in 2001 was the AI of the Covenant, which really felt like a step up from games like Doom or Quake, in which enemies would tend to just charge straight at you. The Covenant communicated, they had a hierarchy on the battlefield, and at times it genuinely seemed like they were trying to outthink you. The Flood are nothing like the Covenant. They are an enemy much more in the mould of those in a Doom or a Quake, a much more one-dimensional threat. And that isn't necessarily a bad thing. In fact, at certain points in Halo Combat Evolved, they even seem like a refreshing change from the Covenant, and I've always argued that the Flood are a brilliant enemy when found in levels containing a mix of different factions. However, when you put them in an environment like the library, one that looks so similar throughout, offers little in terms of variation and features almost no verticality, what you get is 2 very repetitive elements stacking quite poorly on top of one another. The library would have been bearable if you fought the Covenant within it, as at least encounters would have had some variation to them. And likewise, the huge numbers of Flood encountered would have been less boring to fight if the environment those battles took place in was more varied. Unfortunately, what you get in the library is the unholy trifecta of repetitive level design and repetitive enemies, which ultimately also leads to repetitive encounter design. The library always looks the same, the Flood are always going to rush towards you, and they always appear under similar circumstances, jumping from vents or shambling round corners and heading straight towards players. It's boring. Once you've experienced one encounter in the library, you really have seen them all, barring a few in which you receive backup from groups of sentinels, and that means that in pure gameplay terms, it's a level which begins to wear thin very quickly. I've seen some people state that it's Halo's tribute to Doom, but the library manages to take the repetitiveness of Doom, which was absolutely a product of its time, without also managing to include any of its charm. The argument I made earlier that the level is designed to make players feel weary is one that holds true, but there's no excuse for the level being quite as bland as it is. That blandness does contribute to how much of a slog the library feels like to get through, but I don't think that effect would have been lost had Bungie thrown in a few encounters which move things away from what's already included. Simply mixing it up a little once or twice throughout the level would have helped keep players on their toes, without also running the risk of losing that feeling of being in a never-ending environment, fighting a never-ending enemy the library works so hard to foster. And the library really is an environment that can seem never-ending at times, much of which is due to a lack of clear signposting. The vast majority of the library is simply moving through hallways, and you might think it would be hard to get confused with that being the case, but because the Flood tend to spawn in all directions, players will find themselves not only moving around a lot to avoid large groups, but also constantly changing the direction they're facing. What this means is that by the time an encounter is over, players may not remember exactly which way they were headed, or even where the encounter began. After all, there are very few landmarks within the level, and so it's often hard for players to pinpoint where they started a fight, as opposed to where they finished it. The presence of 343 Guilty Spark does alleviate that issue somewhat. He acts as a waypoint himself, but it's still all too easy for players to end up heading in the wrong direction at the end of a firefight, before eventually having to retrace their steps. It's clearly something 343 Industries believe to be a problem too. In Halo's Anniversary Edition, arrows are placed on the floor to avoid players experiencing that same problem. And those arrows do make sense when looking at things purely from a problem-solving perspective, but artistically, I'm not sure they really fit all that well into the level. Ultimately, what you get with the library is quite a jarring disconnect between the atmosphere it's trying to create and the emotions it's trying to evoke, which I think work most of the time, and the gameplay which accompanies it. Gameplay which is hugely disappointing given how brilliant most of Halo Combat Evolved had been up until that point. And there's something I haven't talked about yet which makes this a particularly big shame: how the library affects Halo Combat Evolved's story. Because the library marks a seismic shift in Master Chief's, and by extension the players' priorities. Prior to the library, coming to the aid of surviving humans, fighting the Covenant and working out how to use Installation 04 was the name of the game. But by the end of the library, the true nature of Halo becomes apparent and the stakes have been raised. Halo Combat Evolved is no longer about fighting the Covenant, it's about stopping the Flood. The library marks a huge turning point in the game's story and imbues everything that comes after with a new sense of urgency. It's not just humanity's survival which is now on the line, but the survival of the entire galaxy. It's a great shame then that a level so important to Halo's plot ended up being such a mixed bag in terms of execution. While the library does have atmosphere and its surroundings work well alongside the Flood thematically, the lack of execution in terms of its gameplay means it's ultimately a level which has come to be hated by fans. But I will say one thing for the library. Unlike terrible levels in other games which are played and then quickly forgotten about, the library is one which definitely sticks in people's minds. Granted, for some that could be because they believe it to be just that bad, a shining example of poor game design, but personally I like to think that even though the library isn't by any stretch of the imagination the most entertaining level to play, it has enough positive attributes that, good or bad, it certainly makes an impression. Thanks so much for taking the time to watch the video, I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please consider subscribing to the channel, it would make my day, and hopefully I'll see you all again soon.